We are going.
Supposed to disturb.
We are live.
Gonna let us know.
We think we have, but first of all, welcome to the House Transportation Committee. Today is the 17th. And we're looking at some bills that are committee today and others. And we're going to start off the morning with our attorney from Legislative Council. Anthony Dexter Cooper. They didn't forget your name, but had technical things going on there. And talk about H693, which is an omnibus bill for transportation initiatives. Well, there yesterday we had a bit of a glitch in our live stream, but we believe we have that here prepared today. Are we good? Okay. So Anthea.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. So for the record, Anthea Dexter Cooper from the Office of Legislative Counsel. I have two things that Jeannie has posted under my name for today. And the first thing that I'm going to be going through is the chart. And I think it'll be titled something like Bills on the Wall 2024 and then H693. Unless you would like me to flip the order, I was just going to go by the agenda. So this chart is structured in the same way as past charts have been structured. You'll find one if you go back under my name for bills that were referred to your committee in 2023. That was done partway through the session. So you cannot combine this chart and the 2023 chart and have your whole wall. There's going to be a gap because you had me in earlier in the session, and with the deadlines for introduction being earlier in the second year of the biennium, you do now have the universe of all of the bills that have thus far been referred to your committee. That doesn't mean that another bill is not going to be referred to your committee, like, for example, the miscellaneous motor vehicle bill, but this is the member introduced bills that have been referred to your committee. So the way that the chart is structured is the same as it's been in the past. You've got all the way to the left the bill number. If you click on that, it's hyperlinked. It will take you to the bill. You have the title, you have a very brief summary, and then you have who the lead sponsor is and a designation if there are multiple sponsors. So I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. I'm not going to talk as fast as I did yesterday, since this is all for the most part new. There are some reruns. I've noted that in the very brief summary where it's applicable. And then I'm just going to skip over 693 in the chart. It is included there. And then I'll do like more of a walkthrough with that, because it's kind of like 18 bills all combined into one big bill. So the first bill that was referred to your committee in 2024, H520.
You might have intro. I just want, so for the committee, this is really just just to know what's come in. That's what the purpose. And some of these we'll hear from some bill sponsors. Okay, just. This is, I know has been sending like updates and stuff. So that's the purpose of our time. So it's we have you're going to speak not as quickly as yesterday, but probably pretty quick.
Yes. Okay, H526, an act relating to the redesign of Bridge 9 in Berry City. This is a bridge over Stevens Branch. It's not Bridge 308, which you have a bill on your wall, H4, from last year that you sent the letter on. This is a different bridge over Stevens Branch. This is at Berlin Street in Berry. So it is adding the redesign of that bridge to the Agency of Transportation Town Highway Bridges program. So it would be like adding it to the White Book or adding it to the T-bill that adopts the White Book, with a project completion date on or before June 30th, 2028. And there are minimum design standards that are included. And then an alternative to the redesign, if the bridge cannot be sufficiently redesigned within the parameters in the bill, then what is added to the transportation program is instead the removal of the bridge. And that is also going to have a completion date on or before June 30th, 2028. And like with H308, there are legislative findings in that bill, mostly related to the flooding that has happened in Berry and how that bridge has been impacted or impacts the flow of water there. Rep. Peter Anthony is the sponsor, and there are additional sponsors for that one. Okay, H542, this is an act relating to speed limits in state designated centers. This would allow all state designated centers that are designated under 24 VSA Chapter 76A, not just downtown development districts, to have posted speed limits of less than 25 miles per hour. Currently, it is just the downtown development districts that can have the posted speed limits of less than 25 miles per hour. A note on this bill, if you look at it, you'll see that there's a lot of text that's struck out, a lot of text that's added. Page 2, line 6 to page 3, line 5 is just cleanup, no substantive changes. The only substantive change to law is basically where it's striking out downtown development districts and replacing it with state designated centers. So it's just expanding the universe of places where there can be a posted speed limit of less than 25 miles per hour. And that was introduced by Kate Nugent and others. I kind of love that these next two bills are next to each other in the chart. So thank you, sponsors, for when you introduce the bills. H547 is a short form bill relating to the repeal of the automated license plate recognition ALPR system statutes. There are two of them, 1607 and 1608. You hear discussion of them every 2 years because since they've been enacted, there's been a 2-year sunset on them that have been pushed out by 2 years. If that sunset is allowed to happen, if it is repealed, then it goes back to ALPRs being unregulated. So this would allow for the sunset, and it would then have the enactment of new laws allowing for the use of automated law enforcement. It's a short form bill, so it just has the statement of purpose there. There is another automated traffic law enforcement bill introduced in the House, H562, just below. We're going to talk about this one next. And in the Senate, there is another bill. It is not a short form bill. They don't have short form bills in the Senate. It is not a companion bill to H562. There are some differences there. And that bill is S184. And this short form bill was introduced by Rep. James Harrison. H562 is a standard form bill relating to the temporary use of automated traffic law enforcement. It would allow for the use of automated traffic law enforcement. These are basically traffic cameras. It's going to be a camera combined maybe with ALPR, which is going to take the license plate and convert it to data, and some sort of like radar or speed device. So it would allow for the use of ATLE on a temporary basis from July 1 of 2025. So giving their time to get up to speed in terms of there being the technology in the state and the planning for it until July 1, 2027. So basically a 2-year pilot program. It would allow the ATLE to be used in work zones and at 2 other locations in the state, provided that certain requirements are met. Things like annual calibration, there being sufficient signage at the start and end of work zones and saying when the cameras are in use. Outreach would be required for the months leading up to the launch date. There would need to be a traffic engineering analysis. Only rear plate photos are taken, nothing of the face of the driver. There would need to be daily logging requirements. There would be notice sent to the registered owner, not to necessarily the person who was driving the vehicle. Leads to the next point. Tickets would be monetary only. You would not accumulate points. The first violation in a year would be $0 issued to the registered owner. It's going over 11 miles per hour of the speed limit. Within that 1-year period, there's an escalation for a second violation, and then a third and subsequent. The data preservation is tied to that 1-year mark, and then it resets after the year. So if you wanted to go flying through a work zone, you could do it on January 1st of like every year, and you would be good. That one is free. It's a $0 warning. It would require annual reporting, sort of related to the current reporting that's required under the ALPR statutes. And then on that July 1, 2027 date, it would have the sunset of all of this. So there would no longer be the ATLE statutes. There would no longer be the ALPR statutes for the most part, and instead it would be replaced with a statute that prohibits both the use of ALPR and ATLE starting on July 1, 2027. So at the end of that 2-year pilot program. Obviously, with it being a 2-year pilot program and with there being annual reporting, if you enacted it just as it is, there would be time to extend the pilot program, make it not be temporary, not have that prohibition on the use of the technology be enacted on that July 1, 2027 point. But this is sort of creating an end point, and it is a very like abrupt end point. The technology can't be used after July 1, 2027.
There are a few sponsors.
Oh, yes, that was Rep. Sarah Coffey. Your chair is the lead sponsor. Your vice chair is a sponsor, as well as the chair of House Judiciary. Okay, H623. This is the second of the two short form bills that have been referred to your committee. It's an act relating to access to public transit in rural Vermont. It would require the implementation of a public transit service model based on the benefit and risk assessments required under Section 16 of your T-bill last year. This is the language about the braided service model that I know you're hearing testimony on the report this afternoon. So it would basically require that you do what is recommended in the report, provided that it fully utilizes Medicaid reimbursements as applicable and other available funding. And then it would also require consideration and, if practicable, establishment and funding for the Mobility for All pilot program through Rural Community Transportation, Inc. And that was introduced by Rep. Melanie Carpenter and others. H685, an act relating to pedestrians and pedestrian safety and bicycle and pedestrian facilities. This was introduced by Rep. Lally, member of your committee. This would do a number of different things. It would amend the definition of pedestrian to include someone in a wheelchair or other personal mobility device. It would require, not recommend, that if you are passing a vulnerable user, you provide clearance of at least 4 feet, not recommended that you provide a clearance of 4 feet. It would eliminate the requirement that a pedestrian use the sidewalk when one is present. I know that seems a little bit counterintuitive, but I know it's the example of we just had a lot of snow. If the sidewalk is covered in snow, it might not be passable by someone who is pushing their kids in a stroller. If the sidewalk is really damaged and it's bumpy and rocky, it wouldn't necessarily be safe for someone in a wheelchair to be using the sidewalk. So I know it sounds incredibly counterintuitive when you're seeing it just in this bullet point saying if there's a sidewalk, you don't need to use it. It's not saying like you shouldn't use the sidewalk if it's there and it's safe and it's passable. It would also modify what traffic signals bicyclists would need to follow in certain circumstances. You might have heard this called, I think it's the Idaho stop or the Idaho yield. So if there is a stop sign or flashing red lights, a bicyclist can treat it as a yield if they are making a turn. And if a bicyclist is approaching an intersection that they want to go through, they're able to go with the pedestrian signals, not with the vehicle signals. And there's language in there about how it needs to be safe and they need to check to see if they can make the turn, things like that. Switching a little bit from the rules of the road, the fifth thing that H685 would do would be to allow for select boards to install crossing flags, like the orange flags with reflective material on them on a stick, at crosswalks on town highways if certain requirements are met, so that you would have basically like a bucket on one side of the street and a bucket on the other side of the street, and you can use your flag to cross and leave it in the bucket on the side that you crossed to, and they would go back and forth. And then the final thing that H685 proposes to do is require the Agency of Transportation, in consultation with the Vermont State Historic Preservation Office and the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, to seek to amend this existing agreement. I have a link to it so you can see it, to categorize the creation of new bicycle and pedestrian facilities as either exempt or screened activities. It would change the level of review that is required under the Historic Preservation Act, which is a federal requirement. So we, the Vermont legislature, cannot say that this federal law doesn't apply, but there is an agreement between the Agency of Transportation and other entities in Vermont and the Federal Highway Administration as to certain activities that have a different level of review under the Historic Preservation Act. My notes here are that Section 1 of this bill, that first bulleted item, is identical to Section 1 of H752, and Section 2 is very similar but not identical to Section 2 of H752. I'm going to skip H693. That's an act relating to the 2024 transportation initiatives to improve infrastructure, increase resiliency, and reduce carbon emissions. And I'm going to do like a more detailed, but not very detailed walkthrough of that after we finish with the chart. That is going to take you from page 5 of the chart all the way to page 9 of the chart. H732 is going to round out the bills that you have that deal with cameras for law enforcement with vehicles. This one is putting cameras on school buses, an act relating to traffic cameras and traffic violations for illegally passing a school bus. This was introduced by Rep. Dennis LaBounty and others. You have a few bills on your wall related to school buses in the past, one of which would have been addressing the issue of cars passing a school bus when it's got its stop sign engaged and it's got the flashing red lights. That wouldn't have addressed it with traffic cameras, but instead allowing the school bus operator to sort of vouch for and attest to the vehicle that passed. This is a different approach from that bill. This would require, requiring on all school buses that are type 1 and type 2, that there be video cameras that record images of the license plates of motor vehicles that violate the statute that prohibits passing a school bus when it's got its lights engaged. It also is sometimes if you see like the stop arm come out, that would be similar to when the cameras would be recording the passing of vehicles. It would eliminate completely the point assessment for passing a stopped school bus with flashing lights. So you would no longer, even if law enforcement sort of pulled you over for passing the school bus, that would no longer be a violation that points were assessed for. But instead, it would be a monetary only violation. It could be issued by a law enforcement officer based on 2 things in conjunction with one another: the recorded images from the cameras that are required to be on school buses and a written attestation from the school bus operator. For purposes of when this would take effect, it would take effect on August 1 of 2025, and it would first apply to school buses that are operated during the 2025 to 2026 school year. So a little bit of a ramp up period in terms of when the cameras would be required to be on the school buses and when tickets could be issued in this way. It does not include money for the traffic cameras on school buses, so that would be something that would need to be discussed. H749, an act relating to waive registration fees for volunteer firefighter motor vehicles. This was introduced by Rep. Casey Toof and others. It would outright waive the registration fee for a motor vehicle that was owned or leased by a volunteer firefighter and issued a permit for sirens and red or red and white signal lamps. So if you get that permit, which you need to apply to the Department of Motor Vehicles for, then you would be able to have your registration fee waived. So the 2 would track together. It wouldn't be a second thing that the Department of Motor Vehicles would need to have like an application form for or some other vetting. So if you're eligible for the permit and you're a volunteer firefighter and it is your personal motor vehicle, then it would be waived in terms of the registration fee. H752 is going to sound pretty similar. This is an act relating to pedestrians, pedestrian safety, and motor vehicle safety. This was introduced by Rep. Michael Morgan and others. This is very similar to the first 2 sections of Rep. Lally's bill. So it would amend the definition of pedestrian to include someone in a wheelchair or other personal mobility device. And then it would also have the elimination of the recommendation for the passing distance of a vulnerable user, but it would also apply in the second subsection of that statute to have the recommendation be lifted. So it is then you are supposed to give this much clearance if you're passing a stationary state sanitation, maintenance, utility, or delivery vehicle with flashing lights. H753, this is an act relating to driver education for students participating in the home study program. It was introduced by Rep. Casey Toof and others. It would require the Commissioner of Motor Vehicles and the Secretary of Education to approve by July 1 of 2024, 1 or more driver education and training courses with a behind-the-wheel component that would be suitable for a parent or guardian of a high school age student enrolled in the home study program to use for teaching driver education through the home study program. It establishes requirements on what is included in the course and who is eligible to teach the course. So there would be certain people who would be ineligible to teach the course, even if they were the parent or guardian of a student who was enrolled in the home study program. And then it would require on November 15th of 2028, a written report on the aggregate data comparing students that participated in a driver education program offered through a public or independent high school, let's just call that like traditional driver education, and a student who did the driver education program through the home study program, to look to see if the outcomes were similar in terms of like accidents and passing the road test and things like that. H761 will look very familiar to people who have been on this committee in past bienniums. This is Rep. Ryan Smith's approach to changing the penalties and point assessments for the 3 non-commercial driver licensed distracted driving statutes. So it would modify the civil penalties and point assessments for those 3 statutes. It's 1095A, 1095B, and 1099. And it would create a distracted driving diversion program. So this is H133 that was introduced in this biennium, and it's on your wall, that just made the changes to the point assessments and the penalties. That bill did not have the distracted driving diversion program. So it's H133 plus that, but the concept of changing the penalties and point assessments in conjunction with a distracted driver diversion program was discussed in this committee in 2022, and I included a link to the chart that showed the changes there, because that will look familiar to people who are on the committee in the 2021-2022 biennium. H798, this is an act relating to prohibiting speed bumps and speed humps. It was introduced by Rep. Seth Chase and others. It would prohibit the installation of speed bumps and speed humps unless the agency of transportation or the municipality with jurisdiction over the public highway determines that there is no other traffic calming alternative, and then determine that the speed bump or speed hump complies with the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, the MUTCD. There would be a grandfathering in of existing speed bumps and speed humps that comply with the MUTCD, but they can only be replaced in accordance with the prior bulleted point here, the prior subsection in the actual bill. So it would not be an outright, if that speed hump or speed bump gets damaged and it wants to be replaced, it couldn't be replaced. There would need to be that determination that there is not another traffic calming alternative that would work there. H803 is an act relating to the modification of a motor vehicle's exhaust system. This is a rerun of H854 from 2020, and it's related to the report that is required under your last miscellaneous motor vehicle bill that's due January 1 of 2025. This particular approach would be to say that it's a violation of the motor vehicle exhaust system law if it emits noise in excess of 95 decibels. There needs to be a requirement that the offense be shown by actually proving that the modification has the noise exceed 95 decibels. And there's an exception for certain uses at public exhibitions like races and things like that. And there is a defense for a reasonable belief that the vehicle was not operated in excess of 95 decibels. And your last bill that's been referred to our committee and is on the wall, H804, an act relating to exhibition vehicle registration, also introduced by Rep. Seth Chase and others. It would expand the eligible uses of an exhibition vehicle to be based on total annual mileage, capping it at 1,000 miles. Currently, statute is based on usage frequency, saying you can only use it once per year. And it would increase the registration fee to $50 from $26, but it would also expand the length to 5 years. So that exhibition vehicle could be registered for $50 for 5 years. And there's a little bit about the display of license plates on there. So those are all of the bills that have been referred to your committee that are up on your wall. I'm going to repeat what I said in the beginning, where if you pull the chart that's going to look very similar to this from 2023, you'll see it has a date in it. It's like through January 24th, 2023, I think. This chart plus that chart do not equal your full wall, because there's a gap between the charts for bills that were introduced in 2023 after that January, let's say 24th, 2023 date, and before the bill introduction deadline. If the committee is interested, I'm happy to prepare a chart that fills in that gap. But I just want everyone to know that chart 1 plus chart 2 do not equal universe of bills that are up on your wall.
That might be useful, but it's not, I would say, a high priority. So I think that, is that fair? People, it's helpful for us to see the whole lay of the land, but
Yes, so if you want it, let me know. Happy to prepare it. But until that point, you'll continue to have a gap in your charts.
great. So for the committee, we'll have some of the bill sponsors come in. We have some time later this week, so we'll invite some of the folks to come in to give a highlight stuff. So I'll start doing it.
Okay, do you want to switch to 693?
I'll switch to 693, which is a bill that several members of the committee are co-sponsors on, and we'll be taking this one up. So, so I thought it'd be, while we have, before we get the budget, just worth kind of getting a more than, like, somewhere in between, like a walkthrough, you know, just a look at it.
Not a lot, but not a chart. Yeah. So I rarely come and bring things. Normally Jeannie prints stuff for you, but I thought that it would be helpful if you look at H693, it's a 41-page bill. But starting on page 3, you'll see for the statement of purpose, because this bill is kind of in essence, like, I think it's 18 things all combined in one bill. I would say this is almost like 18 bills. So if you're running through your statement of purpose, you'll see that it's numbered 1, 2, 3, 4. I have printed for you just the statement of purpose. So if you want to have it sort of as a table of contents separate from your bill, there you go. This is not an idea that I think is only useful for you. I've done the exact same thing for myself. And as we walk through it, I'm going to give you page numbers for where the different items are. So it's going to be sort of like a key to your bigger bill.
For everybody.
There should be 11 of them. Okay. So it's 693, where you're actually getting the substance of the bill is not going to start until page 6. So on page 6, an act relating to 2024 transportation initiatives to improve infrastructure, increase resiliency, and reduce carbon emissions. Section 1 is your short title for the bill. So the short title for this bill is that this act may be cited as the Transportation Infrastructure and Resiliency Act of 2024. If you're thinking back to past bills that have been introduced by one or more members, well, always more than one member, by multiple members of the General Assembly, like this bill, a sort of omnibus approach to what I'm going to say has been the cross-section of transportation and climate, there has not been a highlighting of resiliency in past versions. So this one is now focusing on resiliency. You'll see when we get to the legislative findings that there's sort of a reason for that. One of the findings relates to the flooding from the summer. Section 2 should look pretty similar to you. It's a definition section. It's only defining the terms that need to be defined because they're used in the act, and they're usually things related to electric vehicles or the charging of electric vehicles. Section 3 are your legislative findings. I'm not going to go through all of them. They are similar, but not identical to the legislative findings that have been included in the bill like this in the past. But I am going to highlight finding 2, the July 2023 flooding that impacted so many of Vermont's communities, demonstrated that the threat of climate change is not in the distant future, but is here in the present. This bill does deal with resiliency, but it is certainly not by any stretch the only bill that is being discussed in the building dealing with resiliency and the aftermath of the flooding. Those bills were not related to transportation, so are not on your wall. I'm not going to refer to the committee. Section 4, this is the first time we're going to get a section that you're going to be able to link back to the sort of table of contents. So section 4, this is going to be item 1 in the statement of purpose. It's going to run from pages 8 to 9. It's going to increase the annual appropriations to the Agency of Transportation for 2 programs. Section 4, subsection A is the Better Roads program. That's increasing the appropriation. It would be in total a $3 million appropriation. $1 million from the Clean Water Fund, $2 million from the Transportation Fund. If you are sort of trying to just have a little clip notes version in your ear of what the Better Roads program is from the agency's website, it provides technical support and grant funding to municipalities for erosion control and maintenance techniques that save money and protect water quality. The second appropriation that you're going to have here is in subsection B. It's $3 million appropriated from the Transportation Fund for the Municipal Highway and Stormwater Mitigation Program within the Municipal Mitigation Assistance Program. That's a tab in your white book. In this program, there needs to be a transportation link, but it's for things related to, and I just picked a few from the list from the grant document, bank stabilization, culvert replacement, putting in permeable pavers, things like that. The appropriations from the Transportation Fund, that $3 million appropriation in subsection B, is addressed in subsection C, which shall, if possible, utilize federal monies that are available under the Protect Formula program. So this is saying if the $3 million can come from Protect, it should.
Representative Bartholomew, sorry.
Total of 6 million then?
Yes.
Okay.
So if you're doing the math, 1 million Clean Water Fund, 2 million Transportation Fund, 3 million Transportation Fund, but federal if possible.
Thank you.
Didn't hear that last part.
Federal if possible for the $3 million for the Municipal Highway and
Yep.
Stormwater Mitigation Program. Item 2 in your statement of purpose, this is section 5 in the bill. It's going to run from pages 9 to 11. This is appropriating $250,000 from the Transportation Fund to the Agency of Transportation for continuation of the E-Mike incentive program. This is going to look really, really similar to the language that we kind of flew through yesterday, because this is having all of the modifications from the E-Mike incentive program that you put in session law last year. It has the same language about carry forward and deployment in fiscal year 2025. I call this the get the money out the door really quickly, but if you don't, then it can still be used for this purpose subsection. And then it also has language about administrative costs, very similar, in fact, identical to the past language, up to 15% for administrative costs, and the same reporting requirements that you put in the T-bill last year for the e-bike incentive program. I will say that the more that you are doing this as a one-time appropriation for a program under the same parameters that the program exists, the more likely it is that maybe this should find a home in your green books and it would be codified. If you were to do that, so let's say this year you codify the e-bike incentive program, and then this bill is introduced again next year, and there's a desire to have, let's say, $500,000 to go towards the e-bike incentive program, you would cut this section down to like just the one subsection, and it would basically be like $500,000 is appropriated for the e-bike incentive program, codified at 19 VSA section 2909, just to make up a number that would be in that chapter.
Do you want to go all the way through it, or the questions along the way, or how do you want to do that?
I think the idea, we're gonna dig in deeper, so I think the idea is that this is, but if
Just
it's
to
a
walk through.
clarifying question, like, we're gonna go deeper into the policy discussion, so I don't know what your question.
It's, I just struggled to find a verb in the second sentence
Oh,
of,
that's not for now. We're not doing verbs and
Okay.
things,
Okay.
but we, because,
Right.
yeah.
Yes.
Not now.
We'll come back to it.
Nouns, maybe.
I'm just teasing you. I hope that you don't mind me speaking. I'm just, we'll have time for doing verbs, yeah.
Yeah.
Using verbs to.
No.
That's fine.
No comments, no verbs.
That's our biggest worry in this bill, Scott, is time.
Okay.
We like to have verbs.
Yeah, we have. For the record, we do like to have verbs.
Okay, so my need, this number from the statement of purpose aligns discreetly with this section in the bill is now going to get a teeny bit wonky because section 6 is making amendments to 19 VSA chapter 29, which at present, based on the work that you did in the T-bill last year, is the codification of your vehicle incentive programs. What the next few items in the statement of purpose are going to do are make changes to the reporting requirements that already exist for those vehicle incentive programs and add to Chapter 29 reporting requirements on electric vehicle supply equipment. So you'll see on page 11, lines 7 and 8 in the chapter heading, instead of it just being vehicle incentive programs, it's now also going to cover electric vehicle supply equipment. Going back to your statement of purpose, item 3, this is going to be on page 12 of the language. It's requiring the reporting that comes back from the Agency of Transportation on an annual basis related to the vehicle incentive programs to also address the state's marketing and outreach efforts related to the programs. That's on page 12, lines 1 and 2. And then also to require, and this is down on lines 17 to 19, that annual reporting include any recommendations for how to better conduct outreach and marketing to ensure the greatest possible uptake of incentives under the programs. So not just reporting on these are the number of incentives that we gave out, but these were our marketing and outreach efforts, and this is how we think marketing and outreach could be improved. We're then getting to the new sections that are being added. These are all going to deal with electric vehicle supply equipment. That's sort of your technical term for charging stations. Item 4 of the statement of purpose. This is going to run pages 13 to 15. And the new section 2906, starting on line 3. This is putting into the green books what is currently in session law for the electric vehicle supply equipment goals. Nothing is changing. It's still 1 driving mile of every exit off of the interstate and 25 driving miles of another level 3 charging port available along a state highway. Section 2907 is expanding upon what is currently required, which is just an up-to-date map showing the locations of all of the level 3 electric vehicle supply equipment. I know that you got a report on that earlier this week. That is currently required under session law, but this is expanding upon that report to it's not just the map that needs to be required, but there also needs to be a report on the state's efforts to meet its federally required electric vehicle infrastructure deployment plan. That's what was required to get the NEVI money as updated with the House and Senate Committees on Transportation, and that needs to come in not later than January 15th each year until the deployment plan is met. That can be done in conjunction with the map. Also need to have a report on additional efforts to deploy EVSE through any state EVSE grant program. So if you think back to past efforts to get electric vehicle supply equipment out there to be used, it wasn't just an approach of we're putting them along the interstate and we're having these 1 mile circles and these 25-mile circles, but trying to put them at like ski mountains or parks or at multi-unit dwellings. So requiring reporting on the state's efforts under any of those state grant programs to increase Vermonters' access to charging at workplaces, multi-unit dwellings, and community attractions also needs to come in on January 15th of each year. And then the report, and this piece needs to be done in consultation with the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, which is now regulating as of just this fiscal year, the charging stations that are available to the public and the frequency that electric vehicle supply equipment available to the public is broken or unavailable, and include recommendations on how best to minimize the frequency that electric vehicle supply equipment available to the public is broken or unavailable in that same January 15th reporting date each year. Could be 4 reports, it could be 1 big report. And that's will be addressed in subsection B, saying that it can be combined. It needs to be filed with the House and Senate Committees on Transportation, and it needs to be prominently posted on the Agency of Transportation and Agency of Commerce and Community Development's websites. You might be asking, how are we, and I'm going to skip section 7 for a second, how are we going to get information about when electric vehicle supply equipment available to the public is down or broken or otherwise unavailable? January 1, 2024, that date needs to change. That should be January 1 of 2025, cannot go back in time. But the Agency of Transportation, in consultation with AAFM, would need to develop and utilize a complaint form for consumers to report on instances where electric vehicle supply equipment that's available to the public is broken or unavailable. And that complaint form needs to be on the Agency of Transportation's and AFM's website. And I'm going to circle that date so that if you do move forward with this language, everyone is on the same page, that we are not going back in time. And then the section that I skipped, section 7, that's repealing the current requirements that updated electric vehicle supply equipment map be reported each year, because that has now been incorporated into the reporting that's going to be required on an annual basis. That's more than just. So that is going to take you through item 4 on the statement of purpose, which is going to run pages 13 to 15. The complaint form, which is going to be on line 19 of page 3, the reference to it, that's section 8, that's on page 15. The requirement that the written plan for how to fund and maintain is the next one we're going to deal with. So I'm now at item 5 of the statement of purpose, starting at line 20, and that's section 9, fully on page 15. It's requiring another report. This is not an annual report. This is a one-time report, not later than November 15th of 2024. Agency of Transportation, in consultation with Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, the regulator of the public charging stations, and Commerce and Community Development, which has been involved in the EVSE grant program, the state one, needs to prepare a written plan. It can incorporate other plans that have been prepared for purposes of getting the NEVI money to for how to fund and maintain the electric vehicle supply equipment that is going to be necessary sort of across the state writ large for Vermont to meet the portions of the goals of the Comprehensive Energy Plan and the Climate Action Plan related to the uptake of electric vehicles. And that written plan needs to be filed with the House and Senate Committees on Transportation not later than November 15th of 2024. If you're following along in the statement of purpose, we're now on to section 10. This is going to run pages 15 to 17. This is dealing with a further appropriation for the state program, the EVSE grant program. This is the one that's run by the Agency of Commerce and Community Development. It would be $3 million for the program. It's a continuation of the existing programs that have existed here. Subsection B deals with eligibility, where grants can be awarded for the locations for charging stations. It's projects that meet the requirements in 2022 Acts and Resolves number 185, section E903, B1A to C. There was a fourth subdivision there. There was a subdivision B1D, and that was for charging stations that were going to be available at state workplaces. So like the Agency of Transportation putting in a charging station at, sure. Yeah, that would not be something that this $3 million could go for. The things that it would be eligible for would be multi-unit dwellings, private workplaces, and those like community attractions, parks, ski mountains, museums, things like that. Very similar language you're going to see in subsections C and D. Administrative costs can be up to 15% of the appropriation, and the carry forward and deployment language that's basically saying that get it out as quickly as you can, but if you don't, it's used for the same purpose. And subdivision 2 is a little bit different because it talks about how every reasonable effort shall be made to obligate and deploy the monies appropriated for expenditure in fiscal year 2025, that sort of hurry up language, but reference back to the requirements to meet the emissions reduction requirements of the Climate Action Plan and statute as they were amended by the Global Warming Solutions Act. Outreach and marketing language, they need to do outreach and marketing, and that's going to round out the money for the grant program. This is going to take me to item 7 in your statement of purpose on page 17, section 11. Another one-time report also due on November 15th of 2024. We talked about how you have the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets that are doing regulation of the charging stations that are available to the public. So that's basically saying if this machine is telling me that it dispensed 1 kilowatt hour, did it. But there could be other levels of regulation related to electric vehicle supply equipment. If you think back to the 2019 session, there was an ongoing report that the Public Utility Commission was working on related to how to increase the uptake of electric vehicles in Vermont. At the time, there was language in statute that basically said that if you were going to be selling electricity, you were going to be regulated by the Public Utility Commission. And there was a carve out for like if you plug in at a campground. One of the things that was included in the T-bill that year, even though the PUC hadn't finalized its report, was language to also exempt charging stations, electric vehicle supply equipment from that. If you're selling electricity, you're under the regulation of the PUC. At the time, charging stations that were not utility run, like a BED charging station, would need to be selling by time, which is a less transparent and less like regulatable way of selling electricity, because how do you know if it's dispensing quickly or slowly? You don't necessarily know how much electricity you're getting for. All you know is you were paying for the amount of time that your car was plugged in. So there's already been an effort to say that the PUC is not going to be regulating the sale of electricity from electric vehicle charging stations. But Section 11 would require the PUC, in consultation with the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, and of Transportation, and the Office of the Attorney General from the Consumer Protection Division, to prepare a written recommendation on what level of regulation, if any, maybe not, should be placed on electric vehicle supply equipment available to the public that is not owned and operated by an electric distribution utility. And the written recommendations for that report go back to the House and Senate Committees on Transportation, the House Committee on Environment and Energy, and the Senate Committee on Finance and on Natural Resources and Energy. So lots of committees would be involved, not later than November 15th of 2024. And this could be dealing with things like how the price of a charging station is displayed, you know, how you see the gas price is prominently displayed, but you don't necessarily see how much a kilowatt hour is going to be if you are using a charging station until you're like actually there. I've heard that sometimes you need to like plug your car in or maybe have an app, but this would potentially be addressing that level of regulation. Still dealing with charging of vehicles, but switching tracks a little bit. A lot of pages are going to go by quickly here because this would be a lot to go through in a detailed level. Item 8, establish right to charge laws to permit property owners and tenants to install electric vehicle supply equipment. This is going to be sections 12, 13, and 14, running pages 17 to 28 of the bill. And this is based off of language in, I think mostly all came from California, and it's preventing condo associations and landlords from prohibiting the tenant or the condo owner from having a charging station. And certain requirements need to be met and certain reviews need to happen. There's a lot there. I think that's something that if you are interested in moving forward with, I should do a more detailed walkthrough. And you're also probably going to want to hear from attorneys for both landlords and condo associations. I'm now going to scroll quickly and take us to page 28. Page 28. This is fully absorbing H574 as section 15. It's going to run from page 28 to 29. It is not a bill that is on your wall. It was referred to a different committee. It doesn't deal exclusively with transportation, but it does deal with utilities making available the ability to increase the electricity that's going to residences. It has findings specific to the bill, talks about the transportation sector contributing nearly 40% to the state's total greenhouse gas emissions. That is one of the other findings that you have that's overall to the bill. Talks about the Global Warming Solutions Act and the strategies for reducing transportation emissions reductions now being law. Talks about how Vermont has adopted a suite of motor vehicle emission standards. Those are the California ones. That's where we couldn't deviate from it, but we could adopt full cloth the California regulations. That's under the Clean Air Act. We're getting to now a little bit less of the transportation focus, but high customer charges for utility line extensions and service upgrades associated with beneficial electrification and EV charging are a barrier to implementation of these policies. You're not going to be able to charge your vehicle if you're not going to be able to get electricity to your home where you want to charge your vehicle. And this is especially significant in rural Vermont. And then in subsection B, it's requiring that the standard level of service to the meter, getting way out of my depth of knowledge, I did not write this bill, in each regulated electric utilities tariffs for line extensions and service upgrades need to enable the residential customers who request to participate in substantial domestic electrification, including level 2 charging. So not saying they need to have level 3 charging, not something that you would necessarily be having in a residence. That's the one that charge quickly. You know, you're going on a road trip, you're pulling over and getting a sandwich, but the one where you could charge overnight. It would also be providing sufficient electricity to do the level 1 or the trickle charging. On or before December 31st of 2024, the Public Utility Commission needs to, by rule or order, ensure that the standard level of service is available to the customers of all regulated electric distribution utilities, and the utility tariffs need to conform to Public Utility Commission rule or order on or before December 31 of 2025. So saying by end of this year, by rule or order, the PUC needs to ensure that there's that standard level of service, and then the utility tariffs need to catch up to that rule or order standard level of service by the end of the following year.
I just, did that have a item number in the statement of purpose?
Yes, that is item 9.
Okay.
Item 9, section 15, going to run you pages 28 to 29, and that is H574.
H574. You understand, yeah. If he is speaking quickly, like that section is also another bill.
That was not listed in this, right?
That is in the House Environment and Energy Committee, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, now we're dealing with public transit. So I feel like we talked about resiliency and the grant programs there, and then we switched to electric vehicles and the charging of electric vehicles, and now we're going to public transit. Section 16, this is item 10 in the statement of purpose. This is going to run from pages 29 to 31. It's a report that would be coming back from the Agency of Transportation. They need to prepare that report in consultation with existing nonprofit mobility services organizations that are incorporated in the state of Vermont for purposes of providing Vermonters with transportation alternatives. This is going to be Car Share Vermont, and I'm going to forget its actual name, so I'm going to use what Capstan has been calling it, but Ruber, that rural Uber. Entities like that that are working to achieve the goals of the Comprehensive Energy Plan and the Climate Action Plan, and the Agency of Transportation's Community Engagement Plan for Environmental Justice. They need to develop a written plan to determine what programmatic elements need to be in place to allow for the expansion of car sharing in Vermont. So I'm going to use as an example here, because it's something that has come up in the context of Ruber in the past. But should the insurance requirements be different? Should they be more like what is required of transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft, where there's sort of like a 3-phase to the insurance requirements, where different insurance levels need to be in place if the driver is looking to get a ride, if they have someone in the vehicle, if they're on their way to a ride. So different stages of insurance requirements. Maybe that's something that should be required. Should there be different background checks that are required? Things like that would be something that could be incorporated into these programmatic elements that need to be in place to allow for more car sharing in Vermont. At a minimum, the written plan needs to identify a number of different things. The feasibility and desire of existing nonprofit car sharing operators to begin expanding car sharing services to Vermont municipalities through sub-grant agreements and operating contracts with one or more of the following: municipalities, nonprofit organizations, and for-profit service providers. I think we heard last year that there's some agreements with like Green Mountain Transit to provide rides. The development of criteria to determine where car sharing is feasible. that it might not be available in all Vermont communities. Obviously, there's a need in rural areas, but maybe there is not enough of a need to support car sharing in rural areas. So looking at that, how to determine the ongoing financial support necessary and the financial sources available to expand and subsidize car sharing services for a minimum of 3 years, a list of potential nonprofit entities or for-profit entities for both that would undertake the operating responsibilities and car sharing satellite locations outside of the main service area of the operator, and then the estimated costs for expansion of car sharing in Vermont. And those estimated costs need to include, could include more than acquiring plug-in electric vehicles, acquiring the electric vehicle supply equipment to charge them, the vehicle operating costs, administrative costs to oversee and manage a statewide car sharing program, cost to meet annual expansion goals or targets within the capacity of the car sharing operator or operators. And then also would need to be included in that report any metrics and measure costs for service and the impact on, that should not be carbo emission, it should be carbon emission reductions and services provided. And the written plan needs to come back by November 15th of 2024. You'll notice that there are a lot of reports that are due on November 15th of 2024. That's to sort of align with, and obviously it's the first year of the biennium, so it's not as much of a rush to get your drafting requests in, but so that the information is available to the committee before you start your work. So if you think to November 2024, you will have gotten elected, and then like 2 weeks later, you get this great report that you can read and will provide you information for the work that would be done in the 2025 session. Section 17, this is item 11 on the statement of purpose. It's going to run you from pages 31 to 32. This is appropriating $750,000 from the Transportation Fund to the Mobility and Transportation Innovation Grant Program. If you think back to yesterday and back to last year, there was $500,000 for the MTI grant program. This iteration of the MTI grant program is slightly different. The program would be continuing to be based on the work that was done in 2020, but grant awards would be available for both capital and operational costs, so an expansion there. And then the creation of this new early application window for applicants that are seeking a grant award for a project that's in a rural community. So the early application would allow applicants that are seeking a grant award for a project in a rural community to have at least 2 months before the regular application window opened to work with the Agency of Transportation to present a grant application that will actually meet any grant requirements. So there would be that 2-month window for like a dialogue with the Agency of Transportation, and applicants that are seeking a grant award for a project in a rural community will have an opportunity to resubmit an application after getting feedback from the agency. So not saying that they're getting priority, but they are getting a 2-month window to work to make sure that the documents that they're submitting and their idea that they have would be eligible under the MTI grant program. Switching from public transit and mobility to Amtrak, one section on Amtrak. This is section 18, item 12 in the statement of purpose, all on page 33, requiring the Agency of Transportation to request 3 things of Amtrak not later than November 15th of 2024. And after making that request, the Agency of Transportation would then need to coordinate efforts with Amtrak on the 3 items. The 3 items are the feasibility of adding additional daily service in the southbound direction on the Vermonter for some or all of the service area, the feasibility to expand service on the Valley Flyer to provide increased service on the Vermonter route, because those connect, and the feasibility to update rail equipment to increase bicycle storage on Amtrak trains on the Vermonter and the Ethan Allen Express routes between April 1 and October 31 each year. The Agency of Transportation needs to file 2 written reports on its efforts and anticipated outcomes, and those would be due not later than November 15th of 2024 and March 1 of 2025, and those go to the House and Senate Committees on Transportation. Why the 2 reports and the 2 dates? You're requiring that request be made by November 15th of 2024, so the "we have made the request" could be the only thing that is in that first report that's due November 15th, 2024. But because the second part of subsection A says that after making the request, they need to coordinate efforts, And then you have your report in the middle of your 2025 legislative session that would be talking about those coordinated efforts. Section 19, this is going to be item 13 on your list. It's going to be on page 33 to 34, making a change to the Transportation Alternatives Grant Program. Under the Transportation Alternatives Grant Program, we talked about this yesterday. This is the one that is fully federally funded, and there is for the next few fiscal years, the increase in the grant award from the statutory amount of $300,000 to $600,000. Under statute, there's a requirement in fiscal year 2024 going forward that 50% of grant program funds, and then there's language about how it could be less if there aren't enough applications to cover it, need to be reserved for municipalities for environmental mitigation projects relating to stormwater and highways, and that can include salt or sand shed projects. That would not be required. So it would say that the amount of money that is available under the Transportation Alternatives Grant Program could go to sort of any eligible activity. There's not this carve out for those environmental mitigation projects. And that would mean that there could be more money going to bicycle and pedestrian projects. Section 20, this is going to be item 14 in your statement of purpose. It's going to run you from page 34 to 35. It's increasing the annual appropriation to the Agency of Transportation to provide grants for bicycle and pedestrian facilities projects. There are currently federal aid, large scale projects, and then small scale projects. I know that $20 million on line 16 seems like a really gigantic number, but a lot of that money would be federal money. And then under subsection B, it says that $20 million appropriation is to be used to maximize grants provided for the federal aid and large scale projects. And then the balance of the $20 million would be used for the 50% state portion of small scale grant awards. And that's a 50% state, 50% municipality. That's going to take us to section 21. This is on page 35, all on page 35. Item 15 in your statement of purpose. This is two appropriations that are or appropriations or transfers. The first one is the annual transfer from the Transportation Fund to the Downtown Transportation and Related Capital Improvement Fund. This is something that's always included in the big bill. For a while, it was going back historically, I think at one point it was $800,000. And then for a long stretch, it was $423,966. I have no idea where that number came from. But for the last, I think, 2 or 3 years, it's been $523,966. So this would be increasing it to $1 million. And my little summary of what happens with money from the Downtown Transportation and Related Capital Improvement Fund is just rearranging the words because it's for transportation capital improvements, like just using words from the fund. But what I can provide you with is it's only available in certain locations. So like a downtown area, not in any municipality, but it's for capital that would be there. So like a construction project. The other appropriation that's addressed in section 21 is $600,000 from the Transportation Fund to the Agency of Transportation to provide grants to municipalities that are required to provide a 10% local match to the municipalities under the Better Connections program. And that program helps municipalities plan for growth, having multimodal development, land use. And this is a multi-agency managed program. It's the Agency of Transportation, ACCD, and I think there's one other state department or agency that's involved there. Item 16 on your statement of purpose. This is pages 35 to 37. It covers section 22 of the bill. This is addressing complete streets and the Vermont state standards. Requires a number of things to be completed by the Agency of Transportation, not later than July 1 of 2025. So if this is enacted sort of in the normal course, about a year. Need to incorporate complete street standards that are consistent with 19 VSA Chapter 24. That was the language that you codified last year. That was the sort of slightly beefed up version of the prior law on complete streets and putting it all in one place. That needs to be included in the replacement for the Vermont state standards. The Agency of Transportation needs to develop a way to target funding for complete streets projects within state designated centers under 24 VSA Chapter 76A. Sometimes when you're hearing talk of what is done for complete streets projects, you'll hear Massachusetts held out as an example. And in Massachusetts, if a municipality develops a complete streets plan, they can get additional funding. So that could be something that was suggested here. Third item that the Agency of Transportation needs to do by July 1 of 2025 is to develop a pattern book or other design guidelines that identify best management practices to provide safer bicycle and pedestrian accommodations. And the fourth item is to establish clear standard treatment guidance for providing safer bicycle facilities on state highways. So looking at having the designs for the bicycle and pedestrian facilities and a standard treatment guidance to provide safer bicycle facilities. In meeting the requirements of this reporting requirement, the Agency of Transportation needs to kind of engage in a mandated like outreach plan. So the Agency of Transportation would need to release a draft of the replacement to the Vermont state standards and any related documents not later than January 1 of 2025. And then they need to conduct not less than 5 public hearings across the state concerning the replacement to the Vermont state standards and related documents. They need to provide a publicly available written explanation of the Agency of Transportation's reasons for why it decided to overrule substantial arguments and considerations raised for or against anything in the draft of the replacement to the Vermont state standards and related documents. And there needs to be consultation directly with the Vermont chapter of AARP, American Association of Retired Persons, the Vermont League of Cities and Towns, the Vermont Community Development Program within the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, and regional planning commissions and transportation for Vermonters. So those are called out as specific entities. This is based in part on the outreach that was required for rulemaking under the Global Warming Solutions Act with respect to the suite of California Clean Car Standards. And then because that went through rulemaking, that includes the requirement that the adopting agency respond to those substantial arguments raised for or against. This specifically requires that because it's not expected that the Vermont state standards are going to go through rulemaking. So it's kind of piggybacking off of outreach that's been required in the past in conjunction with rulemaking, and then drawing that public response piece from the Administrative Procedure Act. And the agency needs to provide written updates on its progress in meeting the requirements not later than November 15th of 2024 and March 1 of 2025. So if we're thinking about the timeline of this, let's say this is good, becomes law effective July 1 of 2024. First update, not later than November 15th of 2024, January 1 of 2025, the draft of the Vermont state standards and related documents gets released. March 1 of 2025, there is that second update, and then all of those things need to be completed by July 1 of 2025. So there are those several targets or checkbacks over the course of the year. Section 23, this is going to be item 17 in your statement of purpose. We are almost done. It's going to run you from page 37 to 38. This is identical to H542. Rep. Nugent's bill is fully absorbed here. That's the shift from the downtown designated centers to the state designated centers. Section 24, back to dealing with some money, but this is forward looking. It's requiring a report on sustainability options. This is item 18 on the statement of purpose. It's going to run you through the balance of the bill, pages 38 to 41. Just section 24 requires the state treasurer, in consultation with the Agency of Transportation and Natural Resources, Departments of Finance and Management, and of Motor Vehicles and of Taxes, to develop a written proposal for new revenue sources for dedicated and ongoing funding to preserve, improve, and expand existing transportation infrastructure, to develop the modernized infrastructure needed to support the widespread adoption of public electric vehicles and electric vehicle supply equipment, and to mitigate environmental and health impacts of the transportation sector in Vermont. So basically, how are we going to pay for all of this stuff that we need to do related to resiliency, getting more electric vehicles there, infrastructure that just needs to be replaced? Where is the funding source going to come from? At a minimum, the written plan needs to address the feasibility of 3 things. Vermont participating in some sort of regional or cap and invest program, such as the Transportation and Climate Initiative or the Western Climate Initiative, or a cap and reduce program. Also needs to look at the feasibility of Vermont adopting a clean transportation fuel standard, which would be a performance standard or performance-based regulatory approach that would cover transportation fuels, sort of like the clean heat standard, but for transportation. And the third item that needs to be looked at, and the report could look at more than just these three items, is Vermont implementing a tax or fee on delivery services or vehicles for hire or both. I'm going to use as an example here the fact that in the city of Burlington, there is already a quarters fee that is paid for each trip end that starts or finishes in the city of Burlington for vehicles for hire, your traditional taxi cabs and your transportation network companies. So it could be looking at that on a statewide basis, covering vehicles for hire or like Grubhub or things that are delivering food to people or potentially other delivery services. The written plan needs to include an estimate of the amount of revenue that's generated from each of the proposed revenue source that's analyzed. So those three that are required and then anything else. A summary of how the assessment of the proposed revenue source that's analyzed would be administered, collected, and enforced. So the how much could we get and how are we actually going to go about getting it? The written plan also needs to include a legislative proposal to implement any of the proposed revenue sources that the state treasurer determines is a viable revenue source. So it would need to address all three of those things if all three were viable. But if the treasurer determines that none of those three are viable, but this other alternative that has come up with is viable, then that would be the one that would need to have a proposal for implementation. The state treasurer needs to file the written plan with the House and Senate committees on transportation, House Committee on Ways and Means, and the Senate Committee on Finance not later than November 15th of 2024. The state treasurer needs to retain a consultant if necessary to develop the written plan. And then subsection G, I'm not going to go through the two pieces, but it's basically the how is it going to get paid for, the consultant. If it can come from the EPA's climate pollution reduction grants, then it should, the $100,000. If it can't, then the state treasurer needs to consult with the Vermont Climate Action Office and the Agency of Transportation to try and find another federal funding source to pay for the consultant. Everything in the bill takes effect on July 1 of 2024 to align with the federal fiscal year or the state fiscal year. That's 6 things.
You're impressive.
Amazing.
Yeah.
It was nice talking slower today. I like that. But I am really glad that you got the overview of the T-bill yesterday, because a lot of this does relate to a continuation of work or a program that was funded in the T-bill.
I was, maybe I missed something. I was wondering if you could review really quickly what you were talking about, the standards and rulemaking.
Oh, yeah.
It's a sort of,
point.
how that would work.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure I grasped that.
So this is actually really interesting. The state standards that exist now are actually an adopted rule. And they probably shouldn't have been, because it's not really how documents like that are necessarily created going through the rulemaking process. But that doesn't mean that there aren't facets of the rulemaking process that wouldn't provide valuable feedback to the Agency of Transportation and the development of the state standards or the replacement of the state standards. So the two pieces that are addressed in, and I'm going to get my section number wrong if I don't look it up. The two pieces that are addressed in section 16 are a minimum number of public hearings that need to be held. And that is similar to the approach that was taken under the Global Warming Solutions Act in terms of there needing to be almost a listening tour to get feedback on what was being considered for the adoption of rulemaking. And then under the Administrative Procedure Act, there needs to be something that's usually called, just sort of colloquially, the responsiveness summary. So under the APA, an adopting agency needs to have the initial proposed rule. And then between the initial proposed rule and the final proposed rule, there's a window of public comment. And if a substantial argument is raised for or against something in the initial proposed rule, the adopting agency needs to respond to it. So you'll see adopting agencies that will create almost a chart or a summary report. I actually use the one for the clean car rules as my like example of this is a really good responsiveness summary when I'm talking about the APA. They'll say, you know, we have aggregated all of the comments that we received. A number of public commenters said that they thought that I'm just going to use something roady, that the, you know, minimum shoulder should be 45 feet, not 5 feet. We think that a 45-foot shoulder is ridiculously wide and it would require a massive amount of acquisition of property through eminent domain and it just isn't feasible. So we're sticking with 5 feet, just to pick a ridiculous example. But it requires the adopting agency, or in this case, the agency of transportation that wouldn't be adopting anything because it's not through rulemaking, to respond to the comments that it receives in a very transparent. We're laying out our sort of explanation and our thought process and the reason why we're either sticking with our initial proposed version or we're going to deviate to what commenters think we should do, or maybe somewhere in the middle, or maybe a completely different approach. It would be kind of requiring that process that has been required for the Global Warming Solutions Act rules in terms of the additional public hearings, because under the APA, you're only required to usually have one public hearing, and then also requiring the equivalent of a responsiveness summary.
So is the distinction that normally with rulemaking, it's not as open and transparent a process? Is that fair to say, or?
So the rulemaking process is very open and transparent because you're required to have the public hearing, because you're required to have that responsiveness summary, because there are the multiple versions. But rulemaking might not necessarily be appropriate for like design standards for what is thought to be the replacement to the Vermont state standards. I think it's kind of thought from a like looking back historically perspective, like, oh, it's weird that that was done through rulemaking,
Okay,
but sort of following the model.
thank you, Andrea.
That's a great question, though. I appreciate I think it's good for the committee to understand, and we have the expert on rulemaking here with us and yeah. Other questions about this? I think, you know, we're gonna take up some testimony, you know, like a lot of that's in this bill is in relationship to the, as we said, the T bill, you know, that we passed last year, but it's, you know, a lot of this relates to the budget, and we'll be, you know, hearing from the Agency of Transportation and other folks to hear testimony. And yeah, so it was good to get kind of like, well, we had some time before the budget dropped to get an overview of this. And so, you know, if it's helpful to the committee, you know, I can kind of more intentionally like demonstrate like how we're weaving those pieces together. So when we have testimony coming in, the agency will, you know, we're next Tuesday, the budget, the governor will give his budget address, and then on Wednesday, we'll be starting our budget process. So when we have that come in, we can just make sure that it's about the budget and that we can kind of toggle a little bit between both. We're going to take a little bit of a break too, and I want to like do some discussion about the other, give the committee, you know, we haven't had a lot of committee discussion time yet this session, and I thought it would be a good time to have some committee discussion about the bills that have been in, what we are think, get the feedback from the committee, some housekeeping, and a couple of other things. So we can do that. We'll have about 45 minutes to an hour to do a little bit of that this morning. But I think this is helpful. We'll go deeper into some of the things of this bill, and
Verbs and things.
Yeah.
Verbs.
verbs and things, verbs and dollars for sure, and you know, and dollars and cents, and we'll get some testimony in on it, and it'll be a process, you know, we'll have a robust process, because it's folded into the work that we do in the first half of the session. So, Anthea, this is great. It is kind of nice how it worked out yesterday afternoon, you know, talking about last year and then how we are setting up this year. So why don't we take, unless there are other questions from the committee, why don't we take a little bit of a break and be back here at 10:45.